Okay, everybody, I just wanted to get started here and show external guest user folder sharing. We're going to kind of walk through today how it actually works, go through and log on to some QA servers, and I've got a couple of co-workers on here with me, Rick, Scott, and Ricardo, and I'll be relying on those guys to ask some questions if I'm missing some obvious points. So let's just start by looking at what is the advantages of using MyWorkDrive guest user sharing. So, from our standpoint, the biggest one is if you were to create a user for outside person, you would typically need to be able to manage that user. You have to set their passwords. You have to figure out a way to get them their password. You have to deal with the two-factor authentication, all of that, and then how are you going to manage them going forward? So that becomes a big support burden for companies. And so by using the MyWorkDrive guest user folder sharing feature that we're building into the server, what you're able to actually do is let those users fully collaborate with users internally on a specific share. So rather than just sending them a link to a file that may or may not expire, that they may or may not be able to do anything with, they can actually work within an entire folder and truly collaborate on a specific project. And those folders also work within our new Teams app as well, so that way they can collaborate there also. But the nice thing is that, from an end user standpoint, their authentication is actually all happening over at Azure AD. By default, it'll actually even send them to a prompt where they have to put in their cell phone number to prove their identity. So you already know that when you're sending it over to them at their email address, that they're logging in using their own account that they either already have, or they'll be creating one in Azure AD on the fly. So it's not something that you'll have to manage. And most companies already are using Azure, so users will likely already have an account. So from their standpoint, they just use their email address to log in. Yeah, and then as I mentioned, the big thing is that you're not dealing with anonymous folder links or passwords that are stored in databases, because MyWorkDrive just uses your Windows file shares. You don't have to worry about migrating those files into a database in order to be able to share them, because otherwise, if you renamed those files or folders, then those shares would no longer work, those links. So rather than having to move those files to OneDrive, which is an option that we do provide as well, you can keep those folders in place and allow these external users to work on them side by side with your internal users. So just a quick overview. Of course, we have our network file servers where you have your existing file shares. You've got some Active Directory over there. The MyWorkDrive server is typically a standalone server. It runs IIS website, and then these end users are connecting over HTTPS to that. And in most cases, these collaborators are probably just going to be using the web client. So here's basically the way it lays out. So you've got your existing Active Directory, you've got your MyWorkDrive server that's connected to your file shares, of course. What happens is when we invite a guest user, it'll create a dummy account in Active Directory that the user's never actually able to log into, because it's going to automatically check a box to be able to do that. And then we will link that account to a guest user invite that will be stored in Azure AD that supports this through a process they call B2B, guest user sharing. And so that is actually not creating an account in Azure AD, it's just creating an invite. So that user still exists in their own Azure AD with their own Azure account. And so from that standpoint, that user is logging on to whatever their own company is for company one, their own company for company two. So what ends up happening is once they accept the invite for that email, then as long as they're logged into their companies or their Azure AD, then they will be prompted to log in with Azure AD SAML, which is configured on the MyWorkDrive server, just like any other internal user. They'll click it, they'll log in, and then they'll see whatever shares you made available to them. Make sense?
Sure does.
Good, yep.
Great. So I just want to point out that we're gonna jump right into kind of going through how it works. Of course, our support guide this is the actual link to the support guide. If you just do a search for B2B, that's another easy way to find that. Okay, so I am actually on my WorkDrive server. This is running version 6. And so one of the first things that we need to do is we need to make sure Azure AD SAML is enabled. And of course we have separate support document on that. I would need to point out, however, we don't need to have that be the same Azure AD that is used by internal users. The My WorkDrive server can be a separate server. You can set this to not required and then just have those users that are external log in to SAML, and maybe your other users log in with username password. You can have a separate My WorkDrive server, or you can also point it to a separate Azure AD account, which the basic version is actually even free. So you don't have to tie this into your companies. A lot of companies will go ahead and do that, and typically the way they use Azure AD is they start by having Office 365 subscriptions, and then they sync their AD accounts over there. So that's kind of how it usually starts. That's perfectly fine to use that. These accounts will be guest accounts that really won't change, but some companies don't have Office 365, or they might want to separate those from a security perspective. So that's the first thing we need to do. We need to enable it. We don't have to make it required, but we do need to have SAML Azure AD set up, and we have a really easy way to be able to do that on our support site. You just literally put a couple values in, make your server public, paste in the metadata URL, and you're good to go. So once you do that, then what we're going to do is we're going to enable guest user access. And then at that point, we're going to be filling in some values here. So we're going to be choosing an OU that we're going to be storing these in. That's just so you can more easily segregate these users internally, so it's easier to find them if you want to delete them or clean them up. We'll be using an Azure AD group that will also be putting them in when we create them for you in Azure AD. And as I mentioned, we'll be creating an account internally on Active Directory as well as in Azure AD. Then we have in the Active Directory group, this is your internal one. This again could be any group that you want. It's another way to be able to segregate these users, although you may even use the same group when you enable guest user sharing on a specific share. And then these parts here, the app ID, the app tenant ID, the app secret, and the optional prefix that we put in front of the username, in order to be able to create that, what we need to do is we need to have what we call a app registration. Now we've got a document on the article that I referred to earlier that talks about how to set up the app registration manually. You can see that here it is. We've got our app ID. What we did is we also created the ability to be able to create that using PowerShell script, and in the future we will actually be integrating that into the admin panel. Hopefully, we're waiting on the API to be available for Microsoft to be able to do that. So as of the first version, you'll still have to do that one step with PowerShell, but it's fairly straightforward, and there's the actual PowerShell script is available here in order to be able to do that. So you download and run that script, and what that's going to do is just prompt you to log in to Azure AD with an account that has rights, and then it will go ahead and create your app registration, and then that app registration will then automatically get filled in here. And so then the reason we need that is because what's going to happen is when I go to invite a user, I'm actually going to create an account in Active Directory on your behalf. I'm also going to create the guest invite in Azure AD. So that app registration allows us to do that. And you can see once that's done, you'll even have an option once you invite some users to be able to manage those guest users. So right within here, we can resend the invite. We can also delete users that we've previously invited as well. So once that's done, and you've got the SAML done, you've enabled guest user access, then at that point, we can go ahead and invite a user. So you can see we actually even already have some on here. So on this little local test share, for example, we now have a separate section that's enabled down here for guest user access. So if we were going to turn it on from scratch, we at least need to specify an NTFS group. That could be the same group that we used, but typically what companies would do would be project 1 group, project 2 group, project 3, where they maybe have a bunch of separate folder shares that they want to make available to different people outside of the company. And so you would assign those guest users to those external NTFS guest groups. And those groups are the ones that give them NTFS permissions. So if you've got this share, this one's local, of course, in the real world, it would be on an UNC path, but that group needs to have rights. So those users are going to automatically be added to those groups and need to be able to have permissions on the folders just like any other internal user would. So I can go ahead and enable that. I can go in here and I can do a search in here, and then it'll automatically plop in here as well. Once I do that and I save it, then at that point I can go in and add a new user. So if I go in and add a new user, I'm going to put in our demo user. And then at this point now it's went ahead and created that demo user account. So with this, what we'll need to do is we'll need to decide what level of access we want to give them. We now have granular permissions available in version 6, which is a really cool feature as well. Most folks might not want to allow the map drive, which you can turn that off. Office Online Edit might be something you do allow them to be able to do. The reason we have some extra options here is because we have data leak prevention on as well, which is a setting within Enterprise, so that you can even just allow them to do view only. So in the case of that, I could turn off all of these and allow them to just do view, or maybe I can allow them to view and then edit documents online, which would be great for a guest user. So I'll go ahead and save that, and let's see if we can find any guest users over here. So go into Azure AD. And let's just go ahead and add a filter. And there we go. So there's our demo user. So you can see here, you can even resend the invitation here. And one option when you resend is if they're just nearly not getting the email or you want to redeem the invitation for them, you can just copy this to the clipboard right from within here and redeem the invite so they're automatically approved. So if that's something that you want to do, that's one of the processes you can do as well. If we go back to the end user, here's their email invite from Microsoft. It actually comes from Microsoft. So if we go ahead and we'll see that it's actually going to be sending me to a specific server to be able to, once I accept the invitation. So at that point, then I'll be taken to there after I click accept, and then at that point, I'll then just be logged in. So let me go ahead and accept that. Now that I accepted that, I can go right to that address, and here we are. I'm now able to get to that share. So at this point, I'm actually logged in with my Office account. It has nothing to do with the server that we're sharing from. It's a completely separate domain. And now me as administrator, I can go in and manage that user. There's a couple places I can do the management. So I can see on the share here that that user's been added. That's the name of the user. That got appended because that's what we allowed in the settings here. If we want to append some other name or we don't even want to put a prefix in there, we can just clear that out. It's just nice to be able to see that that's an option.
Makes them easier to search for in AD if you're ever looking for them specifically.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then if I bring over here a domain controller, you can see that if I refresh this, there it is, there's the account. That's the email address. If I actually look at the details on the account, you can see it's demo at my work drive. Even though I don't have a UPN suffix like that, we're still able to go ahead and create an account and be able to put that in there. That's how we link the two. So you can disable this account from here and remove this account. You don't really need to do that, however, because if you go over here to the enterprise settings, we can manage users right from here as well. And if we delete the user here, it'll just go ahead and take care of deleting them from both places. So then it'll be gone on both sides. So if I click delete here, it'll delete it from AD, it'll delete it from Azure AD as well. So,
I have a question, Dan. I understand totally when I accept the first time and I go in and I'm taken to the share I can see. The second time I want to go in, how do I get to it?
that email that you received has the link. It's probably a good idea to go ahead and send that link to the user as well, saying, wait, I just sent you the invite. Here's the web address. That's what I did over here. So in this case, my little, test server is that. I enabled SAML as being required, which is what most people will do. If that's not the case, then they would be putting in /account /SAML as the URL that they will send to those folks.
But that's
also in the invite as well. So
okay, I got you.
Yeah, so they can just go back to the old email. So
it'll also appear in their Office and Azure portals, right? They can search for my work drive in there because they'll now have an account that links to it.
Right. So at that point, as this guest user, you can see I didn't enable any download capabilities, but I can edit online. I can view files. So this is allowing this guest user to be able to view online, but there's no option for them to be able to download this file. I went ahead and enabled their capability to be able to do edit online. I can click that and edit online. They would need an Office license to be able to do edits. That's a Microsoft requirement. And as I mentioned earlier, all this stuff is on our support site. We have the script over there. We're going to be making some improvements that we're going to be adding to this as well. We're going to be no longer requiring the PowerShell just to create that app registration. We're also looking at, is it possible for us to go ahead and set it up so that you can delegate a specific user to be able to add users to a specific share guest invites. So we're looking at that as something in version 6.1. So then you can get IT out of that business completely within a specific share and allow a couple of power users to be able to do the invites and removes of guest users within that share as well.
The important point to reinforce is we're leveraging technology that Microsoft built into Azure AD. This isn't something we created. It's all designed around the concept of making it hands-off for the administrator once it's all configured. Your users' accounts are their own. You didn't create them. You don't manage them. You don't have to hand them logins or usernames. It's secure. We've got the smart card link on there, which obviously they now can't log into the server. So even if they did know the address for an on-prem device or happen to be on-prem as a guest, at a meeting, they still wouldn't have access, even though they have a login specifically to that one share via my work drive that you granted them.
That's right, exactly. And they're still getting the two-factor to prove who they are, so you know that they can't just email that username password off to somebody else. And then you know the identity is proven, and you're not having to then manage that user going forward with them calling your help desk because they can't log in, or figuring out how you're going to transfer that password over, or do the password reset tools and things like that.
All of that is account.microsoft.com, and you can just sort that out themselves.
That's right.
And you've got the security of being able to remove them from AD, from Azure AD, from my work drive, whatever process you have for closing and terminating accounts. My work drive just seamlessly works in with that alongside all your existing AD users.
Right, and here's the article that you were actually mentioning, Scott, right here, the Microsoft article, Azure Active Directory B2B, and that's something that they've been pushing for quite some time, and a lot of other vendors are using as well, to be able to have enterprises to be able to extend their internal apps to companies outside of their own.
We're really fortunate that their tools have evolved sufficient that we can deliver it in an easy to use way, built in through the interface. I think all of us on the call have stepped through the manual process, and that was a little tedious, but as it's built into my work drive now, it's pretty easy.
Yeah, and that's kind of been our goal. Rather than doing the whole PowerShell thing and do the invites through there, we're trying to add as much as we can to the GUI, and we're going to continue improving that as we go forward.
And I'd also like to say thanks, and just remind everyone, if you do have any problems, you can go to the support link on our page or email support@myworkdrive.com. We'll be happy to help you step through the process, get you through any hurdles, and get us up and running for you.